Hello and welcome again to this edition of Capital Dateline. I'm your host, Brad Swanson. We're here at the Florida Cable Telecommunications Association's headquarters, just a few blocks from Florida's capital. I am once again joined by the executive editor of the News Service of Florida, Jim Saunders. Jim, welcome.
Thanks.
All right, so we had a short week last week, which means the pipeline just got built up, and now we've got 3 weeks left of this legislative session, and things are about to get real. So budget. That's top on the agenda this week. What's happening?
Well, the House and Senate passed their budget plans last week, which are quite different, billions of dollars apart. So hopefully by the end of this week, we'll get a better feel for how they're going to proceed in terms of trying to reach an agreement on the budget and start negotiations.
How far apart?
Well,
are they?
I mean, it depends how you count it, but
Right.
it could be as much as $4 billion apart. But I think the major thing is to look at the actual details of it are very different as well. One thing that has to be resolved before the real detailed negotiations can start is that the House and Senate leadership have to come to agreement on some big numbers. You know, how much money goes to education, how much money goes to health and human services, how much money will be set aside for tax cuts. And that is a big part of the process because they are so far apart in different areas of the budget that they're going to have to get these sort of high-level numbers settled before they can actually start the conference process of negotiating all the details. So, I think it's going to be really telling whether by the end of this week they can get get those big numbers resolved, and then the details start to play out.
Well, and really those big numbers seem to be wrapped around philosophical arguments as well. I mean, in the space of education, you've got, a philosophical argument both for charter schools receiving some of the funding. Higher ed is also caught up in the differences between the House and the Senate philosophy. So can you walk us through a little bit? Just let's take education as an example in the budget.
Well, you're exactly right. I mean, there are some big picture, policy issues that are wrapped into the budget for instance, higher ed is probably the easiest education example in that Senate President Joe Negron has made a big push to increase funding and make a lot of changes in the university system. Meanwhile, the House is talking about reducing funding for the university system. So there are hundreds of millions of dollars, potentially hundreds of millions of dollars apart there. I'm not sure that some of the policy issues are that far apart in terms of, for instance, President Negron wants to expand Bright Future scholarships. We're not hearing any big pushback from the House on that idea. But how can they arrive at the numbers that are going to sort of satisfy both sides? K-12 funding is another issue. One of the issues there involves a bill that was very controversial on the House floor last week. Involves something the House is calling schools of hope, and essentially, sort of the short version of it is to allow or to help nonprofit charter schools go into areas where there are failing public schools and allow students from those traditional public schools to go into charter schools. And the House wants to put $200 million into that program, a new program. $200 million is a lot of money. Again, we're not really hearing pushback from the Senate that this is a bad idea, this is not something we want to do, but again, trying to come to agreement on a number there. I mean, they're not $10 million apart on some of these big issues. They're big numbers apart. There's another education issue that involves property taxes and how much property taxes increased value in property taxes will go into the education funding formula for K-12 education. And there's a significant difference in philosophy on that issue. So again, those are the types of things that the Speaker and the President and their top chairman are going to have to work out before all the details start to be negotiated over the next, hopefully, couple of weeks.
Yeah, and you look at healthcare, you look at education, you look at transportation, you look at the biggest chunks of the budget, and all of these differences really add up to that $4 billion.
Well, and I mean, we've talked about it many times, but the whole issue about economic development funding, Visit Florida funding,
sure.
They're going to have to, again, come to some sort of agreement on particularly Visit Florida. They're going to have to reach a compromise on that. And the governor's still out pushing for money for Visit Florida, Enterprise Florida. So that's another sort of example of a big picture issue, philosophical issue that they're going to have to come to some sort of agreement on before all the details can start to fall into place.
And compared to those other numbers, those numbers look small, but that is really in the philosophical argument category.
It is. I mean, they got what we think is going to be a pretty big boost last week, though, in that Governor Scott and the Trump administration announced that there's going to be $1.5 billion available for the low-income pool program, which is something that's been an issue for years in Florida. How much money the state and essentially what the program does, it sends extra money to hospitals that serve a lot of low income and uninsured patients. And there's been a lot of questions about how much money would be available for that program in the coming year. So last week, the governor and the Trump administration announced there'd be $1.5 billion, which can help a lot because not only will it allow more money to flow to hospitals, but it also may free up some money in terms of the way the budget is put together that can be used to fill some other holes that otherwise might have to go to hospitals. So that was something that kind of people have been waiting for, watching, and it came in with a big number last week. So that may help kind of grease things along a little bit.
Well, and this is where the art form of putting the budget together and being a negotiator for both the House and the Senate, really comes. It's the art form of the process.
Well, I think the other thing too to remember is we've got very experienced people on top of both chambers in terms of their budget experience. Joe Negron, the Senate President, is a former Senate and House Appropriations Chairman. Richard Corcoran, the Speaker, is a former House Appropriations Chairman. Jack Latvala, who is the Senate's top budget appropriations chairman, he's been around forever, knows all the tricks.
He'll be at Tiger Bay this week as well.
Yeah, exactly. So, they know how the process plays out. Now the question is whether they can come to agreement on these big issues.
Right. Okay, so let's move away from the budget because obviously you can spend all day talking about that, and let's talk about, while it might have budget impacts, but the issue of gambling versus how do we spend what we've got. We're talking about the topic of gambling, gaming, depending on the side you're on, that's how they talk about it. And really this is about the Seminole Compact and the other folks that are engaged in this business and parity and things like that. Where does gambling stand? When does it come up? What are you looking at?
Well, the House and Senate are very far apart on it, but something interesting happened last week in that both, and this had been telegraphed it was going to happen, but the House and the Senate both appointed a conference committee, a formal conference committee to try to work out their differences on gambling. Now, I mean, this isn't unheard of, but most of these issues get resolved in other ways rather than having a formal conference to negotiate. But they're talking about starting that potentially early this week. And the House and Senate have a long ways to come on that issue, on trying to reach a gambling agreement. It's always hard to reach gambling agreements. There's so many interests, so many different views on gambling. But bottom line is the House approach is to try to reach an agreement with the Seminole tribe that would bring in money for the state without expanding gambling in a lot of other venues, whereas the Senate is far more open to expansions, including allowing slot machines at pari-mutuels in several counties across the state. So they've got a long way, big differences to come. But it looks like they're going to do it in a formal process, which is, a lot of times bills like this get worked out behind the scenes. But it looks like, some of this is going to be done, again, pretty much formal negotiations.
Definitely expect all the players to come in and testify at that committee if there's an opportunity, or the lobbying and the phone calls to everybody who's on it.
You can there's a lot of gambling lobbyists out there.
Yeah.
You can bet that they're going to be filling whatever the meeting rooms are they have for these conference committees are going to be full of lobbyists because there's a lot of money involved and a lot at stake for the industry.
Right. Likewise, the opponents will be there as well. I'm sure.
That's true.
I'm sure. All right, so let's move away from gambling. So Uber, right? Or it's really a telephone-based or a telephone
app-based.
App-based. Thank you.
Yes.
Application to summon a car and you ride and it bills your credit card. What's going on in state law with that? But it's called the Uber bill. Right?
Well, everybody calls it the Uber bill, but it also is a Lyft and everything else.
Right.
But anyway. you know, it's been a few years. The House has been trying to pass a bill backed by this growing industry about statewide regulation of the industry. Transportation network companies is what they're technically called. And the Senate has been resistant in the past. But the House has already passed out its bill. I believe they passed it unanimously, and now it's coming up on the Senate floor this week. So it looks like there's a really good chance that this bill is going to pass and could pass relatively quickly. Basically, the issue is that, you know, have a statewide regulation, regulatory rules for the industry. The industry wants this because they don't want to have to deal with, you know, could be literally hundreds of different regulatory frameworks in local jurisdictions, counties, cities, and so they have been lobbying for this for a few years. But it looks like it has a pretty good chance of happening this year. The Senate, the bill has flown through the Senate and Senate committees, and now it's ready to go to the Senate floor.
Well, look, for everyone and our viewers that are under the age of 35, I just needed to point this note out. Telephone is an old word for what we call a smartphone. So, all right, so let's move on. All right, so we're going to look for that this week. Medical marijuana, the constitutional acts of implementing, that's really what the Senate and the House are working on. Where does that stand?
Well, it's coming up in both chambers this week in committees, but they are still pretty far apart on that one as well. They need to pass a bill to carry out the constitutional amendment. I mean, this constitutional amendment had support from more than 70% of voters in November, so it had widespread support, and it directed the legislature to put a framework in place to move forward. They've been fairly far apart at this point, but it's going to have to be something they work out. Again, it's starting to move forward, but I'm not sure where that one's going to end up in terms of how they're going to resolve their differences on it. One of the big issues is how many licenses the state should issue to nursery operations that would be able to grow and process and sell the medical marijuana. There's a lot of fighting and a lot of lobbying going on that issue.
Yeah, well, I know that's a total sea change for the state of Florida and our legal system. So,
well, there's also a lot of money involved. I mean, a lot of people are seeing this industry as being really potentially lucrative in the future in terms of hundreds of thousands of patients could qualify for medical marijuana in a state the size of Florida. There's a lot of operators who want to get in on the business.
Right. All right, Jim, well, thanks for that. And so right now we've got 3 weeks left. For our new viewers to the process, roughly 250 to 300 bills pass and ultimately become law, and ultimately, you know, over 50% of those happen in these next 3 weeks. Right. So it's going to be crazy.
I would think it would probably be more like 75, 80%. There's not a lot that's passed at this point, both chambers, and gone to the governor. Right. But you're right. I mean, the final 3 weeks are a madhouse in terms of bills flying.
Right. Well, we'll look for regular updates from the News Service of Florida, and we look forward to seeing you a little bit more regularly between now and the end of session. And thanks for your commentary. Appreciate you. That's all the time we have for today's show. Please check us out on our Facebook page at Capitol Dateline Online, or connect with us on Twitter at the FCTA. Thanks for tuning in.